Pray. Let's give the time we've got to the Lord. Jesus, it's remarkable that your life has been studied. More hours have been spent studying your life than any other subject in all of human history. And yet, Lord Jesus, just with the literally hundreds of pages we have to record your story, you give us so much to mine and so much to dig through, and are such an inspiration and a challenge. And so, Jesus, just we pray that will happen again tonight, as we just kind of revisit words. In one sense, we know them anyway, but just to kind of feel them afresh, to be inspired by them again. In Jesus' name, Amen. Amen. So we're slowly working our way through this through the last week material. I'm going to keep on flagging. Part of the reason I wanted to do this for the kind of the partnership side of things is it means that if you haven't been able to make one of the live days that we do, actually it gives me the excuse to be able to send you, if you want copies of the manuals, because technically, as I think you know, because of using certain artwork and so on, we can only sell them or whatever in the context of actually delivering a teaching. So this is a kind of way of providing the two, so that everyone who's in the partnership can get hold of those manuals as they're still work in progress. But it's been a really, I just, even before we kind of get going on the material tonight, so I want to really, which I want to do in a couple of weeks, if you're coming able to make the Partners Day, I wanted to really emphasize and thank you as folks who have made this really happen. Because just the process of producing the manuals and the stuff that we've done up to this date, and then continuing to do things like I'm doing now, just allows more and more pieces to slot into the kind of framework that's being developed. And it's one of the things that without it wanting to sound like this is really good, we've got it right, but what's quite remarkable is I keep getting new things sent to me. And so just a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some teaching somewhere, and Howard, who doesn't come to the live sessions here, but he comes to some of the sessions I do locally, came and bought an article he'd found, and it had a reference to some material in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so I was able to go and download that, and it's suddenly given me a kind of fresh insight on Jesus's relationship with John the Baptist, and so that will go into one of the presentation slides, which means eventually when it all gets written up, it will also be in there. And it was a new piece of work, it was a new piece of research. It had been done by a guy a few years ago in the US, done it as his doctoral piece, and he'd then written a little article and put it online. And I say, but the fact that it was done by a single person, it was stuff you could trace back, and suddenly you're seeing, if you like, the messianic expectation that was around in Jesus's day, matching even with similar words that they're in the text of this Dead Sea Scroll to the response that Jesus gives to the John. He kind of seems to be quoting almost Essene teaching or Qumran teaching. So that, I know that's nothing to do with tonight, but it's kind of highlighting how each time these things are kind of coming together, they fit very nicely into this framework, which I've been trying to kind of pull together in the Gospels, to kind of understand, if you like, the historical story, with the kind of social context and the political context and the messianic prophetic kind of context, how they all blend together. And I kind of regularly just feel, as you get those little bits, what an incredible privilege it is to be at a time when you can start pulling these things together and see how they fit. So again, I just wanted to kind of thank everyone for making these things possible. Just even turning up on nights like tonight means that I keep on kind of adding to things and so on. So we're in that bit where we're working through the material which we put together for the Living the Last Week. And as I said, when we do a day, in theory you have 8 hours, but we don't have 8 hours, because we get going around 10 or 10:15, and we normally finish about 4:30, and you normally have an hour at lunch, and you have a couple of breaks from coffees and so on. So during a day you might get 5 hours to teach through this last week, and we're now, I think, on week 7. Or the 7th hour, and we spend about an hour at a time. So this is giving us an opportunity to kind of actually just take the material a little bit slower, and just let it kind of really hit us. And so there's an element of that tonight, and there's some other bits which we haven't put up on PowerPoints before, but they've been in other material. And we're going to actually now look at this kind of key, crucial moment, which is the actual conviction and crucifixion of Jesus, and just the interplay of the characters this evening. So just quickly to run back from last time, we kind of very quickly finished thinking about where people were on the Friday morning. If you remember, we've carried through, Jesus had been tried over the Thursday. It was Thursday morning that Peter has disappeared somewhere outside of the city. At some point he's going to have made his way back. As we set the scene up this week, we're assuming he's not yet made his way back to the network or the house or the gathering point, which is probably in the Tyropean Valley, if you remember, where all the artisans were, which we looked at some weeks back, where Jesus' family are probably staying. It's where those who ran businesses in the wider countryside would often maintain properties and so on. And that will be the region where Jesus' family is staying. It's probably where John's family are staying. It's where John's house is likely to be. And if Peter has a separate house to John's, that's something we kind of notice. It looks like they seem to be in the same place, Peter and John. But again, that's not necessarily a contradiction, the fact that they're in the same place. And John refers to it as Peter going to his house, and also as John's gospel refers to John being there, and also Peter being there. But remember, if Peter is the head of a kind of a fishing conglomerate of which John is a part of, then the two would be, it may well be a kind of a company house, put it that way. So they've got their place down in the south of the city, and somewhere or other the family of Jesus are probably in the same region that John is able to connect to them. We thought about, obviously, they're members of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, who were there through the trial on the Thursday, so they'll still be in the environs of the temple. Pilate's at the Praetorium. There's the Hasmonean Palace. It's got Herod. It's also got Joanna and Susanna as eyewitnesses. We're assuming that Mary is probably coming on Friday morning. She's probably heading into Jerusalem, because the disciples have been turning up at her location. I put on that map, as you can see, you've got Thomas down at the bottom because he's not there. We don't know where he is. So those are the kind of just the flow. We were looking at, this is where we're finishing last time. So when the morning had come, this is just, again, it's a quick recap. All the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the whole council held a consultation and took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And as we saw last time, that's actually what they're doing, is confirming the conviction, because that was the legal requirement from the Mishnah for a capital case, is you come to a conclusion one day, but you have to confirm it the next day. So they basically, it's a kind of a rubber stamping exercise. They come together and they condemn him to death, and the whole company arose and they bound him and led him, or carried him away and delivered him up before Pontius Pilate, the governor. Because, as we know, they need they need the legality of Rome to actually do what they want to do. So they led Jesus from Caiaphas, this is now John's Gospel, into the Praetorium. But it was earlier, they themselves didn't enter the Praetorium, so they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So Pilate, just continuing with the text, but this is the integrated text as we put it together in the manual. Pilate therefore went to them and said, "So what accusation do you bring against this man?" And what's interesting is right the way through, and we'll take a little bit longer on this than normally we do, but we'll see Pilate seems to be reluctant at least 3 occasions during this trial process to actually execute Jesus. He no doubt is well, I say no doubt, but we know that when he's come in from Rome, he's come in aggressively. He's caused all sorts of problems. He's had the backing of Sejanus, who is the kind of the number 2 in the Roman Empire, but effectively running it. He's treated them in utter contempt. He's caused all sorts of troubles and struggles. Tiberius is now back in situ, but he has a very uneasy relationship with the Jewish authorities, and he doesn't particularly want to comply with them, but there is a sense in which he has to stick now very clearly to proper legal process, because he's slightly in a delicate position, as he was Sejanus's man, putting in place in that kind of context, and so he's being watched from Rome as to how he works. So what accusation did they bring? And Jesus stood before the governor. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found him perverting the nation, forbidding paying of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he is the Christ, the King." So there are two elements there. You get, in one sense, you get the forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar is a very clear reference back to a question that was deliberately asked to him by the priests. And just this kind of little kind of statement that you have here now from Luke's Gospel is giving us context to that challenge, that question. You remember, should we pay Caesar taxes to Caesar or not? You know, they so were convinced that actually the kind of style and nature of who Jesus is, he would give them an easy to kind of criticize him, an easy to get him into trouble answer by saying, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar. But Jesus gave him that brilliant answer. Which is, if you want to participate in the Roman economy, then participate in it. That means pay your taxes. But they've probably got it so in their heads that this is part of what they were going to actually use as part of the foundation as they bring Jesus to Pilate, that it kind of creeps out here, saying he was forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar. And then we get the real reason, saying he's Christ, himself as Christ, and he's a king. Because that means pretty much nothing to Pilate. It doesn't really bother him that much. He understands the concept, obviously, of a king. And they realise, as you'll see as the dialogue goes through, that the king idea is something to start to kind of working on, and to present, therefore, him as a threat to the power of Rome. So Pilate asked him and said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" You see, so they can see, okay, that he's responded to that. And Jesus says, "So you say." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. So Pilate asked him, "Haven't you got an answer?" So you're having a situation where Jesus is being accused. They're throwing this term in that they're sticking with the bit that seems to be registering with Pilate. He's a king. Pilate's asking for clarification because he is aware of the politics of all of this and needs to be careful. But now he's not answering. And Jesus made no further answer, not even one word. So Pilate, the governor, marvelled greatly. So it's something in him that seems to be impressed by Jesus. But then Pilate says to the chief priests and the multitude, "I find no basis of charge against him." But they insisted and said, "He stirs up the people, teaching out through all Judea, beginning from Galilee, even to this place." And there's that little kind of phrase which gives Pilate the kind of the let out, beginning from Galilee, because instantly Pilate picks up on that. He's recognizing the explosive nature, there's the charge, and the realizing that Jesus now is Galilean. He sees an opportunity to kind of get payback with some of the kind of political maneuverings that he's had with Herod. This is, I think we covered this last time, but this is just kind of getting the flow going for the day. So he's going to send him off to Herod, but I've got the text in a little bit more detail. So when Pilate heard Galilee mentioned, he asked if he's a Galilean, and when he found out he was Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod. And as I say, we touched on this in the last session, so apologies if it's repeating what you already know. But it's a very kind of clear sense of kind of relief from Pilate and an opportunity to give a headache back to Herod Antipas, who played a kind of clever political game with Pilate, by kind of watching him kind of take money from the treasury of the temple, which caused all kinds of riots. And then he complained when Tiberius comes back out of retirement to Tiberius about this, saying, Pilate's not done a very good job, and that's where they've really fallen out. And so here is a good opportunity for Pilate to get rid of what is potentially for him a delicate situation. He can see very clearly that this is a set-up job, that he's not a great fan. They played him. They've been difficult the whole time. The Jewish leaders, and with the opportunity, suddenly realizing that Galilee's been mentioned, it gives him his way out, and he sends him up, which of course would be very, very frustrating to the priests, because although it's still very early in the morning, it's still before 7 a.m. When Jesus gets back, John's Gospel is going to tell us it was the 6th hour. Now, that's roughly speaking 6 in the morning. But we can't know exactly how precise, because in the ancient world it's just an about. It's kind of within the watches of. But what we do know is that Jesus would have arrived to Pilate before dawn. We know that Roman governors are expected to be working by dawn. So if he's there very early in the morning, he's probably their first call of business. So it's still only just after 5 in the morning when probably his first first brought to Pilate. So it's before 7 a.m. when he's being sent to Herod. But of course, the chief priests are wanting to get this process quickly because they have to be responsible for the overseeing the kind of sacrifice system that goes on in the temple. Now we know from the rabbinic writings that the actual sacrificing is being done by more menial priests. The reason we know that is because there are complaints made just before the destruction of the temple by those priests who are involved in that process, that according to the law of Moses, they were supposed to be able to keep things like the skins of the animals. That's how they got paid for the service. So I'm going to make your sacrifice before the Lord, and I get to keep the skin because that has value to it. It's kind of currency, and that's my payment for providing the religious service, if you like. But what actually happened was that the temple had taken control of all of the transactions, and so they were just paying them kind of pocket money, and they felt this was grossly unfair is one of the complaints. So in that sense, we know although the chief priests need to be there, need to be oversighting, watching the whole process, they're not physically getting involved in the sacrificing. It's probably been left to more menial, lower down the caste layers of the priesthood, but they still want to be there. They don't want to be stuck in this process. So the chief priests, so now when Herod saw Jesus, so obviously yes, he gets sent off. On that slide, you've got Chooser in the top corner, because as chief steward, he would therefore be involved in receiving Jesus, which allows us to understand how come we get some of the perspective and we understand what goes on in Herod's court. It maybe comes through him or through his wife. So when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. He wanted to see him for a long time because he'd heard so many things about him. He hoped to see a miracle. He questioned him with many words, but again, Jesus gives no answer. So the chief priests and scribes stood vehemently accusing him, and Herod and his soldiers humiliated him. So here's another group. We're thinking of all the different groups, just worth kind of noting it. In the arresting party, we had the temple guard and we had Roman soldiers. When Jesus gets taken to Annas' house, it's now just temple guard. The soldiers have gone back to the fort of Antonia. But now that actually Pilate is involved, it's probably the Roman guard who've taken Jesus again now to Herod's. But it wouldn't be at all surprising if some of the temple guard is there as well. But now Herod has his own guard, and it's these different soldiers this time who are in that place where they're mocking him. And they're humiliating him. They dress him in luxurious clothing and send him back to Pilate. And then we read that phrase that Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. Before this, they were enemies. And that context of enemies, as I said, we have some historic context for, seems to be about the aqueduct. So it's we get this impression, therefore, the way that Luke presents it as a piece of history, that something about them having to deal with what was clearly, if you like, an agenda of the temple, but neither of them were really happy with. We saw that Herod Antipas seemed to feel kind of the pressure and the guilt of what he'd done to John the Baptist. Of course, he was manipulated by his wife, who's there on the slide as well, Herodias. But in this kind of context, it's probably something to do with actually having to deal with these difficult people. It gives you a kind of, if you like, we're enemies, but we've got a common enemy, and somehow our common enemy gives us something to talk about, even if in this context, enemy is kind of political maneuvering enemy. So there seems to be some reparation to their relationship at that point. And so Jesus gets taken back to Pilate. As we read then, so while he's sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message saying, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man." Again, we touched on this last week. I had this slide, didn't do quite as many of the words, but history tells her name's Claudia Procula. There's that kind of simple thing, first of all. There's this, the obvious suggestion that probably they had heard the request the night before that we're going to bring Jesus to you for conviction. Rather than it being a purely supernatural thing. There has been speculation that Claudia Procula would know other dignitary type women, and probably within the court of Herod, because they would be regularly in Jerusalem, and if the family of Martha and Mary in Bethany are wealthy, high wealthy families, she may have had relationship there as well with them as kind of significant women. So there's a kind of various ways in which she could have come to be aware of Jesus there, but we read that statement. She's been deeply troubled. I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. It's one of those weird little things, and it kind of frustrates me. You have to forgive me for that. Is some people, even kind of intelligent scholars, say even intelligent scholars, sometimes people get so hung up on and I kind of get it, and probably I don't want to upset anyone or offend anyone by saying this, but because we take a view of scripture of it being inspired, but what we mean by inspired for some people is therefore everything has to be taken totally literally, which the most inspiring things aren't normally things you take literally, if I can put it that way. It sounds like I'm saying I don't believe the Bible. That's not what I'm saying. The reason I'm saying that is people have actually debated theologically how she suffered greatly in a dream. Was it that God was going to punish her because her husband was going to crucify Jesus? This is the kind of debate that people have theologically, and I'm just thinking, no, I think what it probably means is she couldn't sleep at night. That's what the great suffering is. She can't sleep at night because she is dreaming and feeling disturbed, and she sees that there's something significant about Jesus. It may be that she knows about him through contacts of other women. As I said, I think we've touched on this, maybe not so much in this series, but when we do the whole walkthrough of Jesus' ministry life, we notice several times, say in Josephus, that there was a lot of the kind of the courtly women are connected into the kind of Pharisaic movement, and they kind of have a very kind of active interest, if you like, in support of religious movements and kind of that common sort of spiritual kind of context and so on. So if she's kind of got drawn into that, she may be aware of Jesus from there. We don't know exactly how it comes. It may be a much more of a premonition type dream, but I don't think we need to get too hung up on the fact she suffered greatly. It's probably not literal physical pain with bleeding and so on. It's probably just anguish. That means that she wakes up. Interesting, we get a little bit more information in what's I've quoted here from the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is a late document. It's 5th century, but within it contains a section which is understood as being the Acts of Pilate. Now, the Acts of Pilate, so though it's 5th century, it contains within it the Acts of Pilate. The Acts of Pilate we do find referred to right the way back to early 2nd century. So there is a document that is circulating in the early church called the Acts of Pilate. We actually have a couple of versions of it. So, and this is one of them. It's kind of maintained within there. So we know that neither of the ones we're looking at, well, we can't tell which ones we're looking at were the original because they seem to have developed and so on as time goes on. But there is some sort of testimony that seems to have come from the kind of Pilate household, if I can put it that way, that has crept into, and there's knowledge of it very early on in the Christian church. And the quote I've got here just adds, it's almost identical, but just adds one extra little bit of information. So as we read it, it says, his own wife, who stood at a distance, sent to him saying, and sorry, I just copied this I found the quote online. So have thou nothing to do with this just man, because I've suffered much concerning him in a vision of this night. So pretty much exactly the same, except that it's not so much that she was at home and sends a messenger, but actually she is within the kind of the environs, which plays very much to the kind of that historic understanding now, which we've taken right the way through this program, that the Praetorium is Herod's old palace. It used to be seen as the Praetorium being held up at the fort of Antonia. It's less likely that she'd be hanging around there, but she seems to be within the environs. She's not right in the middle of the action, but she's kind of close enough. She's aware what's going on. She knew what happened the day before. She's got involved and so on. And so she sends her message in. And as we touched on before, she's considered a saint by Coptic, Greek and Ethiopian Orthodox churches. Origen tells us, this is the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. He's the earliest person we have where he actually describes her as a convert. But as I said, we also have earlier references to the kind of testimony that comes from the house of Pilate. So right the way back to early 2nd century, so 120 or so on, and we find references to the Acts of Pilate. which were supposedly a kind of a testimony of these events that have come out of the household of Pilate. So you put all of those kind of things together, and actually there is also a place where, as we're going to see in a little bit, there is also a conversation that seems to be private between Pilate and Jesus. And the question I always have is, so where's the eyewitness source? Who is the eyewitness source? And while, of course, it's not an argument that works with the skeptics, it fits very neatly when we take kind of from that faith position of understanding the Gospels having emerged as the early church tells us they have, when we see how they can account very naturally for all of these things. So the early church are saying she's become a Christian, that there is a document that comes out of the household of Pilate, and we have these conversations which otherwise would be difficult to know where they've come from. There's even speculation quite early on in the statement in 2 Timothy, where right towards the end of 2 Timothy, which is one of the latest books that written by Paul, it's probably written about 65 AD. Some people think it's written about 61 AD. I go for the later date. It finishes, Eubulus salutes you, as do Pudens, Linus, and Claudia, and all the brothers. And I think elsewhere I've touched on the fact that, strangely, Pudens and Linus are a couple that seem to be, or is it Pudens and Claudia? Yeah, that's right. That's the other way. Pudens and Claudia seem to be a couple that we see referenced in other Roman literature. They seem to be quite important.'t there has been speculation as to whether the Claudia there is actually the same Claudia as is Claudia Procula. There are other alternatives to understanding that. I'm just kind of highlighting it as part of the kind of the traditions, the speculation, and so on. But as I say, as we're going to see, someone needs to be close enough to capture some of the conversations, and she seems to be a good kind of potential eyewitness. So Judas tries. Pilate, in one sense, tries again. He's had this warning. He didn't think Jesus deserves death in the first place. He sent him to Herod, but it's come back. They're still demanding. They're not letting it go. He doesn't necessarily fully understand at this stage quite how important it is to them to get rid of Jesus. I've got here, they ask instead for Barabbas. But it's interesting, if you read Mark's Gospel, Mark actually indicates that the request to release someone is actually raised by the crowd, which kind of paints an interesting picture, because you can, as you kind of understand, a lot of this is happening in vaguely public space. It's not that the whole city is crowded there, but there are all sorts of people passing through, and we're told that he is requested that, and he's reminded in Mark's Gospel. I don't think I put the text up because it was a very long passage. No, I haven't put the passage up here, where it's the quote from Mark. He's kind of reminded by the crowd that he's got this tradition, and you can kind of almost imagine in this context, as Jesus is brought back, he's still in the public chair, there are folks around, and somebody throws up, well, you normally let somebody go anyway, you know. And so it's not that request has been driven by the priests and the ruling factions that are pushing for Jesus's death. It's something that seems to emerge out of the context and the situation in that kind of public space. And so the issue is raised, well, Pilate, you do this anyway. And so Pilate proposes to release Jesus. And of course, there are those who are quite adamant. As we've touched on this before, this is the wealthy part of the city. The main crowds, Jesus' main supporters, are not there. That doesn't mean that everybody who is there is anti-Jesus. But this is like kind of being up round number 10 or something. You know, it's anybody could be there, but it's mainly people who've got reasons to be in that part of the city, who aren't the natural supporters of Jesus. So in that kind of context, and it's also possible, sorry, I'm just doing a lot of the speculating, but just to kind of see how it raises your thinking, that the kind of context of you're going to release someone is because someone has actually turned up with the specific intent to ask for Barabbas's release. You know, it could be a family member for all we know. And so within that context, the situation gets raised. It's not what the priests wanted, because it gives Pilate another way out. They kind of counter, because they pick up there's another possibility. There's Barabbas. And we kind of start to move into this interesting situation that enacts for us the Day of Atonement, which the Day of Atonement, of course, is not Passover, but it's a key concept that really holds the books of Moses together. I can say that because obviously at the moment I am in the process of writing Jesus in the Wilderness. Subtitle is Signs and Wonders. I quite like that. I like these little kind of twee wordplay. So Jesus in the Wilderness, Signs and Wonders. The word atonement, or the Day of Atonement, word atonement, is really the theme that really ties certainly the final four books of the books of Moses together. But I kind of treat it as an overarching, if you like. The Hebrew word for atonement, which sometimes is translated reconciled, about 96 out of 100, so something like 102, 104 occurrences in the Bible. I think 96 of them appear in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. And the huge majority of those actually happen in the book of Leviticus. So, if you like, Leviticus, and which is at the heart of those books as they hold together, those kind of the wilderness experience books. At the heart of that, the big theme is atonement, the coming together. How do we bring God and man together? How do we bring tribes together? It's all about bringing together the at-one-ment. I think it was Wycliffe who made the word up, the English word at-one-ment, so it is quite literally as it's spelt out. Sometimes it gets translated as reconciled because it's that kind of peace-bringing process. Jesus talks about blessed are the peacemakers. It's between peace between God and man. So if you like, in that sense, right, that's not in that sense. Right at the heart is the atonement ceremony of the Day of Atonement, right in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus kind of starts with all of the various sacrifices and so on, and then it has this great feast idea of the Day of Atonement, and then it finishes with the enormous Feast of Feasts, which is the year of Jubilee. So it's the kind of the flow of the book, and then so the big atonement kind of the big atonement event in a book that's full of atonement. All of the sacrifices are about making it one month, but the big event is the scapegoat ceremony. And I've pulled out this kind of verse, the Leviticus 16, 7-10, just to kind of get the feel of how it matches what's being acted out. So this is he, and that's the high priest, shall take 2 goats, because Barabbas' name is Jesus. Sorry, I've forgot to mention that. And we know that because the earliest manuscripts of the Bible, he's called Jesus Barabbas, and then as time goes on, the Jesus gets dropped, probably because they didn't want to confuse people, so makes it simpler. But Jesus, Yeshua, is a very common name. So he's Yeshua Barabbas, so he's Jesus, the Son of the Father. Which, as I say, kind of makes him Jesus' doppelganger. He's his kind of evil twin. Jesus is the son of the Father, and Jesus is also the son of the Father, except he's a murderer and a rioter and all of those other things. But he'll take 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the tabernacle of the congregation. So you say, oh, well, this isn't the tabernacle of the congregation, but it's the public space which is kind of represented in those ways. And Aaron, which is the high priest, shall cast lots upon the 2 goats. And so here we have Caiaphas and we have Annas in their high priestly role, are kind of driving a kind of a bit of a Toynkoff situation, because it's not 100% certain which way people are going to kind of go. And they're in that place, and they're actually, of course, not being unbiased. They are trying to bias it in one direction. One lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell and offer him as a sin offering. So the lot falls to one, and one gets sacrificed, and the lot that falls to the other gets released. And between the 2 of them, they make atonement with God. And now there's more to kind of say about the process. There's a kind of demonic dimension to it in the Jewish thinking. That the scapegoat, in one sense, part of the one that gets released out to the desert, is kind of a payment to the kind of pagan deities that now live out in the wilderness. All of these kind of bits that kind of developed in Jewish tradition, which we're not going to touch on now. I just wanted to kind of draw out the sense in which the action is kind of representing something. It's which of course is such a key feast in Judaism. Oh yeah, I've got that slide again for some reason. So then the governor's soldiers, so in other words the Roman soldiers, took Jesus, led him away into the court, which is the praetorium, and gathered together the whole garrison against him. Now that sounds like a lot of folks. I don't suppose it's necessarily supposed to be taken totally literally. It means they're kind of representatives, anyone that's around. So they're all there now. And they stripped him and clothed him in the purple garment, and put a scarlet robe on him. So remember, of course, Jesus has been sent back to Pilate, probably wearing that thing from before, and so it seems to be being reused. And they twisted, braided, or weaved a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt before him and began to salute him, and they mocked him and kept saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So they're turning the accusation, which was supposed to be a dangerous thing, into kind of a mocking thing. So suddenly it's become trivial. In one sense, it highlights how trivial it was. And they took the reed, struck him on the head, and they kept slapping him and bowing their knees, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then Pilate went out again and said, "Behold, I bring him out to you." So you see what Pilate's doing now. It's kind of like, well, he's been flogged. That's probably enough, because I really don't think the guy deserves to die. So he tries another time. This is at least the third time now, isn't it? So behold, I bring him out to you. You may know that I find no basis for charge against him. And they can now see Jesus is bloodied and he's beaten up and he's really been punished. And there's a kind of a sense in which you get the impression that the Pilate assumes that this will now satisfy their anger. And in one sense, if you kind of think of it like this, it's beginning to just show how ugly the anger and hatred of the kind of priestly castes against Jesus is. And so he's wearing the crown of thorns, the purple garment, and Pilate says, "Behold the man." In other words, he's just a man. See him, he's just a man. He's not the king, he's just a man. And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." And Pilate said, "Take him yourselves." So he kind of gives up. I find no basis to charge him. So he's kind of almost abdicating responsibility. And the Jews answered and said, "We've got a law. By our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." And that seems to trigger something in Pilate. So when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid. And then we read, he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus. Now remember, we read that when the delegation came from the priests, they wouldn't enter the praetorium because they didn't want to defile themselves. So the clear kind of context here is that this conversation is actually a bit more private. There are none of the Jewish authorities are in there, because we've been told quite explicitly they wouldn't go in because they weren't going to defile themselves. They wanted to eat the Passover. So he's gone in. So what John's telling us is he's gone in and now he's talking to Jesus almost much more one-to-one. And he says to him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus doesn't answer. And Pilate said, "Aren't you speaking to me? Don't you realize I've got the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" And then Jesus answered and said, "You would have no power at all against me unless it was given to you from above. So those who delivered me to you, the one who delivered to me has greater sin." And there is a kind of a sense, if you just stop and we stand back from the words, that there is a kind of a release to Pilate with something that he is struggling with. And in that, as we kind of stop and we think about that, you can start to see how the if you like, the understanding, and we don't have an early testimony to Pilate becoming a Christian, but we do have later legend, you see. And you have this strange situation where he drops out of the Roman story. He gets called back from being governor, and then he sort of disappears. We don't know really what happens to him. And it's not impossible, and there's something of the fact that we have these words, which, as I say, must have come from someone. Now, we've heard about Claudia Procula, his wife, and she will be in that context. But actually, there's no other kind of clear indication of where this testimony would come from. And so, if you like, that very early tradition that there is an account of these things that came from Pilate, and whether there's someone in the household, whether it's his wife, whether even if it's Pilate himself in some way or other, who has become involved at some point and passed on information into the church, and it gets into John's gospel. Those are the kind of things that we must assume, but they're not outrageous things to assume, if I put it that way. So this Pilate is seeking to release him, you see. So this is now at least time number 4, and the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, then you aren't Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." And when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat on the judgment seat, a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew Gabbatha. And it was day of preparation, about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And it's kind of okay, because that's the big sensitive issue. If Pilate is going to cause a riot, and it's because he's defending someone who's calling himself the king of the Jews, when in actual fact Judea, remember, there's Herod is not king of the Jews, he's king in Galilee, he's king up in Galilee. In Judea there is no king, because the Romans have a governor in place. It means there is no king other than Caesar, who is being represented by his governor. And they cried, "Away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest said, "We have no king but Caesar." You see the kind of context. So then he delivered them to him to be crucified, and they mocked him and took a purple robe off him and put on his own clothes and took Jesus and led him away to crucify him. So although the Romans have mocked Jesus with putting on this robe, there's no way that the Jewish authorities want Jesus to be crucified in kind of regal robes. And they just want him to look as scruffy and as insignificant as possible. Pardon me. And so that Jesus is sent out for crucifixion. So as he gets led away, we read about Simon of Cyrene. He carries his cross, and as we've touched on this before, where characters are named like this, and it's talked about him being the father of Rufus and so on, and just as Rufus, isn't it? And which almost certainly means that in some way or other they become involved with the Christian church, which is why they're named. They're part of the witness testimony of this book. So at this point, it seems that most of the party that John has collected or have gathered at his house have come out, and they, as now Jesus is led out for crucifixion, it becomes obvious where he is, and that those women and Jesus' family kind of get pulled into the mix, who are now kind of progressing up. They've probably not been far away because they know the details, perhaps following them, trying to work out what's going on from a distance. I put there that Mary is probably arriving now from Bethany, because we read about her in the mix. So also there were some women looking on from a distance. This is Jesus is crucified. They were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they used to follow him. And we've touched on these women before in other sessions, so I won't try and do it again here. As Jesus gets there for the crucifixion, of course, there are these various things he says from the cross. So the first thing is, as they're nailing him to the cross, his Father forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And it's such a powerful statement. It is a powerful statement. You can hear the strength of it, and you stop and you think, what's going on to Jesus? But there's something interesting in it, because and I haven't kind of worked this out fully, but it strikes me as you hear the words. Because remember, Jesus is speaking, if you like, he's bringing a divine perspective, and in his divine perspective, as he engages with the Father, he makes an argument in front of the Father that, if you like, their ignorance is, if you like, part of the mitigating circumstances, which actually allows, if you like, grace to work in them. Now, the reason I'm spelling it out like that is because that is counter on several different fronts to certain theological positions that we take. So a position that says that God's grace and forgiveness is given totally irregardless of anything that is a quality of the person. It's kind of almost like there's nothing that God looks at and thinks you're deserving. He kind of randomly throws it about. And that's Reformed theology in its most kind of caricatured way. But the reason I'm trying to draw it out is because actually here, you have a statement, if you like, there's an interaction going on between Father and Son, and the Son is making a case to the Father that is actually, there's something about their ignorance that should be mitigating, and that therefore becomes a part of his prayer for their own forgiveness and repentance and so on. So that there's that kind of there's that aspect, that it becomes a part of the dialogue of the Godhead. So it isn't something that we should be scared of thinking about. that actually forgiveness is not something that I can work out because it is God's prerogative, but it's not purely random. That's what I'm driving at. God has his reasons. There are things in there that he understands and he gets the perspective of, and so on. And the other is then, of course, is what does it mean for us as humans? And actually, that's part of one of the things I think is really important. And I wish that the Christian church would take on so much more thoroughly, which is that in all of the wonderful grace that God gives us, he allows his church to be just as partisan as lots of people else and other people in the world. We have an advantage because as we believe it, we're right. But actually that's not in itself a reason for being as partisan as we often are. And so, we notice that kind of, in the last few days, and I don't want to sound kind of like the most cruel and heartless person. I share these things not to kind of give an excuse to them, but to show how I notice things in myself which aren't the nicest of things. So of all the murders that went on in New Zealand with the mosque, and I remember thinking, kind of feeling that way, but they don't talk like this on the TV when it happens to a church. But that's true, but actually they're people still, if you get what I'm saying. Now, I'm not justifying myself. What I'm saying is it's part of our human partisan nature to kind of like, it would matter more to me if they were Christians. And that's part of the truth that it's in our humanity, but we are kind of challenged to try and live beyond that. We are challenged to kind of see that bigger picture, and Paul challenges us that way in Romans 10, where we don't write people off saying he's going up, he's going down. So, ultimately, because he's going down doesn't really matter. That's not our job in one sense. That we want to kind of own and kind of to be able to hear and to understand the perspectives of those who don't share our views. And that's not to say that therefore we're changing our views. It's just to respect them and to honour them in their position, and to kind of almost to understand how I could have been that person if I hadn't had the experiences I've had, if I can put it that way. So I'm just drawing all of that from this statement, but it's quite profound if you stop and you think about this statement. That this is God speaking to God the Son, saying to the Father, in this context there's a place for grace, and part of that place for grace is they're a bit ignorant of what's really going on. There are events conspiring in history to make these things happen, so actually that needs to be remembered in their judgment, if I can put it that way. So anyway, hopefully you stuck with me through this. Nobody's clocked off just yet thinking I've been too heretical. anything I'm just saying still there. As we kind of read through, I put that little list of things. Most of those, of course, tie so clearly to Psalm 22. The rulers are sneering, soldiers are mocking. Jesus offered soured wine, challenge to save yourself, casting lots for garment. The priests go to the temple. That's not in Psalm 22. I put that there because, of course, once they go to the temple, they disappear from the scene. We know at some point Judas turns up and tries to return the money, throws it in at them and so on. So presumably Judas has been following from some sort of distance and has now seen what's going on. So the second word, Jesus speaks from the cross as he says to his mother, "Dear woman, here is your son," to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And I think that the best understanding here is, and again, if you find that reference in Psalm 22 to the breasts that raised him and so on, and there's kind of concern, if you like, attention towards his own mother, that at this stage in the crucifixion, Jesus is being beaten terribly and so on, but it's going to get a lot worse. His body is going to get very twisted, bones are going to get out of joint. He's going to have a huge amount of pain as blood loss causes reactions in dehydration that are just not normal because it's caused by this slow blood loss and so on. It's going to be in excruciating pain, very twisted, very little strength. It's going to get very ugly, and he just doesn't want his mother, I think, to see him in that context. She's watched what we think couldn't be much worse, but it can get worse. Because without wanting to be too graphic, but Jesus' body is going to kind of shrivel and twist, a bit like when you see a dead spider or something, the way it all crunches up. It's not going to be something that his mother will be able to forget. And so at his request, John, who's probably the relative, as we've talked on, takes his mother back to his house. And actually, at that point, then in John's Gospel, we don't have the next couple of things that Jesus says from the cross recorded, because obviously he's disappeared. Salome also disappears, so she probably has gone as well, as we're assuming she's the sister of Mary. So they've all go back perhaps before Jesus actually dies. And then going on, Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise." That's in the conversation with the thieves who are crucified with him. And again, I don't want to kind of spend too much, but of course it creates all sorts of interest. It's the power. So many of these statements have got so much kind of power to them. That in terms of how do we understand that, in terms of resurrection and so on, all those kinds of things. Lots of different ways people try and solve these things. I'm not going to go into them now. But if there's a future resurrection, what does Jesus mean by you're in paradise? Is it from the perspective of the person you don't notice the passage of time? Is it that eternity is happening in such a different kind of context that we could think of it as both past and present and future? All of those kind of speculations that people make on the afterlife, I'm not going to touch on too particularly. But then at the 6th hour, so that's probably noon now if we're counting from sunrise, then there's darkness for 3 hours, so from 12 till 3, and Jesus cries out in that darkness, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which clearly draws everyone's attention to Psalm 22, so you can see. And then that 5th word from the cross, knowing everything was now finished, to fulfill the scriptures, he says, "I am thirsty." And that's recorded in John, which implies that John is now back from taking Jesus' mother to his house. It's finished, and Jesus calls out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he said this, he breathed his last. Or in John's Gospel, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Again, for time's sake, because I like to kind of try and keep these relatively tight to about an hour, I won't go too far, but all of the Gospels make a statement of giving up the Spirit, breathe his last. Something about the giving of the Spirit, the giving of Jesus' Spirit back to the Father, seems to have some sort of theological content or context to it. And I explore it a little bit in one of the Supernatural Life books. Can't remember which one it is now. It seems to me, my way of interpreting it is that there's something, if you like, where Jesus has achieved what he's achieved in his humanity. Therefore, it's in one sense his human spirit that's going back to God, but his human spirit that was once upon a time a spark of the divine spirit, which somehow means that there's something in the Spirit of God that is actually a human spirit. It's kind of been gifted back to him, which is perhaps why it allows the Spirit of God to live in us without compromising our humanity. So it's just me kind of speculating around this idea that seems so important, the giving back of his Spirit. And the fact that now, because Jesus has been glorified, the Spirit can be poured out on all flesh. So because there's something of it that now fits in a human way rather than kind of dominating in a God way. Put it like that. And Jesus dies, and we read in Acts when Peter's describing it, there's signs in the sky above and on the earth below, blood, fire, billows of smoke. As he goes on and says, as you yourselves know. And we have physical evidence for these things. So in this is a kind of a rock sample kind of going down of seasonal layering from around the Dead Sea. So you can tell when there's an earthquake, several layers get blended together when there's an earthquake. So there's one in 31b, which is event B, if you're looking at that image. 31 BC, then roughly 60 years later, there's another quake. But there's no secular reference, but there is, of course, the reference in Matthew's Gospel. And what we know is that this earthquake occurred sometime between 26 and 34 AD, because you can only date it roughly, which of course is the right time frame. So we know that there was an earthquake, and we have a record of an earthquake in the Gospels, and we have no other record of any other earthquake in that period. So it looks like this is real history. You know, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that, but you understand why. And we are looking at real history that has been recorded by the Gospels. Of course, we can't know this is for sure, but the sun is turned to darkness, which is the Khamsin storm high in the atmosphere. This actually is Jerusalem taken during a dust storm. This is a low-level one, which means you'd know it was a dust storm because you can feel it. But if it's higher in the atmosphere, you don't feel it, but you still get the darkness. And that darkness lasts for about 3 hours. I've taken this description, which if you've had your copy of Jesus in Exodus, and if you've read it, you'll have read this description where we look at darkness in Egypt, because it's the experience of one of these dust storms high in the atmosphere that someone went through. In a few minutes, we're in actual pitch darkness, so the way it can sweep in really quickly. So just kind of saying that we do know these things happen. And then, as we read in Acts, which we don't read about in the Gospels, but the moon will be turned to blood, and he says, "As you yourselves know," this is where he finishes that sermon. And actual fact, on Friday the 15th of Nisan, Friday the 13th, Friday the 15th of Nisan in 33 AD. If you're using the official temple calendar, there is actually a lunar eclipse, which actually would have been dark red from 6:20. And you think about the impact of that is that people are waiting for sundown before they eat their Passover meal. So they are watching the kind of the horizon and the skyline. So huge numbers of people in Jerusalem will notice the red moon rising on this evening, and which is why Peter is able to refer back to it in Acts 2. Got the results there. Were published in Nature magazine in 1983. Nature, of course, is the scientific journal, so they beat the theological journals to that revelation that there really was a blood moon in 33 AD. And then, obviously, we know about the confirming of Jesus' death, which because it's the day of preparation, so the bodies wouldn't remain. They asked Pilate that the legs would be broken, they could be taken away. They can break the legs of the first man. They come to Jesus, and when they saw he's already dead, they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water came out, which means that the pericardium, the sac around the heart, has become filled with fluid, which happens during heart failure under extreme stress. So it really is a broken heart. Jesus dies of a broken heart. That's what it tells us. The actual process is as you dehydrate, because of the blood loss caused by the flogging that Jesus has gone through, slow blood loss, the heart beats faster because it's trying to get blood pressure up, because blood pressure is going incredibly low, so it's beating harder and harder. As it's beating so hard, it's irritating in the pericardium, which then starts to fill up with fluid. And the fluid then starts to create pressure around the heart, making it harder and harder for the heart to beat fast as it wants to kind of get the blood pressure up, which is dropping down. And eventually just the heart wears out and just stops. And that kind of creates the scenario that's just described. What I've given you is a modern kind of a medical description of the process, but what we have is an ancient record that confirms to us something that makes real sense. And tells us, so Jesus doesn't die purely of dehydration, he actually dies of heart failure caused by dehydration, if I can put it that way. So after confirming his death, obviously the high priests lose their focus. They're busy oversighting the most important day of the year. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus spot the opportunity and request Jesus' body. And they get that, so they take possession. Time is short, so they use a nearby tomb which is owned by Joseph. They do a hasty job. They've got basic spices and clothes to wrap the body in, and in this kind of context, Mary, who's Jesus' aunt, and Mary Magdalene, Joanna and Susanna all follow. We read about them following to see where Jesus is being taken. So Joanna and Susanna go into the tomb to help arrange the body. The others, his aunt and so on, and Mary Magdalene stay outside. So Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. See, so they're sitting opposite. Now the woman who come with him out of Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how the body was laid. And to see how the body was laid means they have to have entered the tomb. So then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes, because sundown is coming, and once sundown is there, it's now the Sabbath. And they won't be able to go to the markets. But the women who've come out of Galilee, of course, are part of the royal household, so they will have access to spices. But the four women confer, those are outside as well, and they agree that they're going to come back. The body's not adequately tended. So they agree to return as soon as after the Sabbath is possible. We're nearly there. So Joanna and Susanna go back to the Hasmonean palace. They've got access to spices, so they're able to prepare them straight away. So as Luke went back, they went back to the city and prepared spices and perfumes, but on the day of worship they rested according to the commandment. On the other hand, Mary, who's Jesus' aunt, takes Mary Magdalene back to John's house where Salome and Jesus' mother are, but they have to wait till the market's open before they can go and get spices. And that seems like a good point to leave this. We've spent just over, pretty much exactly an hour running through this little section, but does anyone want to ask anything or make any kind of comments or even just to highlight if there are things that, just as we've gone through this, that you hadn't seen before or struck you in a particular way? It's just always nice to get some feedback. So I don't know if anyone wants to say anything.
The thing that struck me, Kristen, was when you said about the power in the phrase "Father, forgive them."
Yeah.
They don't know what they're doing, and what the Pharisees and the religious community had said previously: "We have no king but Caesar," and they completely reject him. It's all their history.
Yeah.
You know, all the promise of the Messiah to come.
I know part of the reason why I really am looking forward to being able to try and write these down as books, because there are, you know, when as I say, when we kind of have a little bit longer per verse, like tonight, it gives you a chance to draw things out, which otherwise when you're doing the day, you just skim through, if you know what I mean. Because there's so many of these verses that you stop and you think about them. They are actually much more profound than you realise when you jump over them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. Does anyone else want to say anything or comment?
Yeah, so we've been interested about Pontius Pilate. We know so little about him, really, don't we? Apart from what Christians said about him.
Yeah, that's right. So you know, we have we have basic records about him from kind of Roman sources, but once
we do have that.
Once he's removed as prefect of Judea or governor of Judea, we don't know anything that happens to him from Roman sources at all. But we do have traditions, and in particular, as I've touched on this before, particularly Syrian and even the African, so hence the Ethiopian, but because Alexandria was such a key kind of church location very early on. So in Syria and in Alexandria, we have traditions that were maintained, therefore, in the Orthodox Church, which often feel much more like they're in step with kind of secular history. So sometimes the Catholic ones are a bit more legendary, if I can put it that way. So it's not therefore totally to dismiss. I kind of, on a personal level, you probably pick up, I think there's a strong case for seeing his wife in some way making a response, and that would be totally in keeping with kind of the way that the women of dignitaries often did work. One thing that is interesting, that is sometimes highlighted by secular historians, is that the fact that she has gone with her husband to Judea indicates that they do have a close relationship. Apparently it's not at all uncommon, because remember that Roman marriages are often a convenience and political reasons, and there's a good chance that actually it is for political reasons. There is a tradition that she is related to Caesar Augustus, and as I say, it's a tradition, and therefore the idea of her being married to Pilate was probably about shoring up his kind of relationship and position. But that's speculative. But what is a bit more kind of concrete is if she has gone with him to Judea, it would indicate they have a level of closeness, because there was no obligation or expectation that wives should have to go to kind of foreign places where there's a bit more trouble. And the fact that she is there seems to say something. So yes, as you pick up, I was just saying, so I think there's some credit to the idea of her becoming a Christian. Pilate himself is perhaps a bit more speculative, but you can see how, if you like, the testimony or the eyewitness details could come out of the Herod household via his wife, and therefore make it into John's Gospel. So.
Yeah.
Yeah,
good. I think Rome didn't like going to Judea as well with Roman governors, and they were,
yeah.
it wasn't
That's right, because it's such a hot spot.
Yeah, it's a hot spot. Yeah.
Good. Is there anyone else wanted to raise anything or say anything, contribute anything? No, I always feel when we finish this, unlike when you have a meeting and everyone's there live and we all chat and have a cup of tea afterwards, it always feels so abrupt when I say goodbye to everyone now. But it's been really nice having everybody here again.
It's been good, thanks, Christopher.
So yeah, and well, I look forward to next time when we're together. And I'm starting to think beyond, because we'll nearly have finished this kind of walk through the last week. So I'm thinking about what we do next. So if anyone's got any great ideas, let me know, and I will start.